One summer night, my friends Sam, Leo, and I decided to do something we'd always joked about but never really thought we'd go through with. We'd heard the stories growing up, the eerie tales about the old cabin deep in the woods at the edge of town. Supposedly, people who wandered too close to it would see strange things, shadowy figures, ghostly lights, and sometimes hear a voice whispering just out of reach. It was probably just the stuff of local legends, but we wanted to find out for ourselves. We'd been to the edge of those woods plenty of times before, but none of us had ever gone all the way out to the cabin. The rumors were that a man used to live there all alone years ago. He didn't talk to anyone, didn't come into town for supplies, and rarely went out during the day. Some people said he was a hermit, others said he was hiding from someone or something. After he died, people in town started saying his spirit never really left the place, and that he haunted the cabin, waiting for someone to stumble upon it. Most people stayed away, and the cabin had fallen into ruin. Naturally, the idea of finding it sounded both terrifying and exciting to us. We decided to meet up around midnight at Sam's house since his place was closest to the woods. We packed flashlights, a few snacks, and one old map Leo had printed out after searching online for the cabin's location. It wasn't exactly a precise map, but it gave us a rough idea of the direction we needed to go. We were ready, or at least we thought we were. The first part of the walk was easy enough. We knew the paths around the edge of the woods pretty well from past hikes. The night was warm, with a slight breeze, and for a while it just felt like a regular adventure. We joked around, nudging each other about who would get scared first, and Leo, as always, was the first to start cracking jokes. He was the one in the group who never seemed to take anything seriously, no matter what we did. Sam, on the other hand, was a little more cautious, though he'd never admitted out loud. He'd been the most reluctant about coming out here tonight, but I think the chance to prove he wasn't afraid was part of the appeal for him. After walking for what felt like an hour, the path became less familiar. The trees seemed to grow taller and thicker, and the sounds of crickets and owls faded into a heavy, unsettling silence. It was strange how quickly the atmosphere changed, as though the trees themselves were closing in around us. Leo tried to lighten the mood, cracking some joke about how the cabin was probably just an old hunting shack, but I could hear a hint of nervousness in his voice. We finally reached the part of the woods where we'd have to go off the main trail. Sam shone his flashlight on the map, double-checking our position, and nodded. "This is it," he said. I couldn't help but notice how quickly he folded up the map, like he didn't want to look at it too long, as if that might somehow change what we were about to do. We stepped off the path, our footsteps muffled by the thick bed of leaves and moss. The deeper we went, the darker it seemed to get. Even with our flashlights, it felt like the trees were swallowing up the light. After another 15 minutes, we spotted something in the distance. At first, it was just a faint outline, barely visible between the trees. But as we got closer, it became clear. There it was, the cabin. It looked like something out of a ghost story, with its weathered wood, broken windows, and a sagging roof that looked like it might collapse at any moment. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting us inside. We hesitated at the edge of the clearing, just staring at it. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were scared. Leo was the first to break the silence, whispering, "Guess we didn't come all this way to just look at it." He took a deep breath, and before I could stop him, he was heading towards the door. Sam and I glanced at each other, both of us feeling the weight of the moment. There was no going back now. The inside of the cabin was even darker than the woods. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by our flashlights, and the smell of old rotting wood was overwhelming. The main room was empty, save for a few scattered pieces of furniture that looked like they'd been there for decades. There was a fireplace in one corner with ashes that looked like they hadn't been disturbed in years. It was cold inside, colder than it should have been on a summer night, and a strange, oppressive silence filled the space. Leo kept his flashlight aimed at the floor, stepping carefully to avoid the broken floorboards. "This place is a dump," he said, though his voice was barely more than a whisper. Sam, on the other hand, was already starting to regret coming in. He kept glancing back at the door like he was ready to bolt at any second. As we moved deeper into the cabin, I noticed something strange on the walls. There were markings, symbols and strange shapes scratched into the wood, some of them faint, others deep and jagged. They didn't look like anything I'd seen before, almost like they were left by someone who wanted to send a message or ward off something. Sam pointed his flashlight at one of them and muttered, "What do you think those mean?" None of us had an answer, and frankly, I didn't want to know. Then we heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from somewhere in the cabin. It was like a faint whisper just on the edge of hearing. We froze, our flashlights darting around the room trying to locate the source of the sound. Leo, who had been the most confident, looked genuinely rattled. Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The sound came again, a little louder this time. It was coming from the back of the cabin, where a narrow hallway led to what looked like another room. None of us wanted to go down that hallway, but the curiosity, or maybe the fear, pulled us forward. We stepped carefully, our footsteps sounding far too loud in the stillness of the cabin. The room at the end of the hall was small and empty, with nothing but a single chair sitting in the center. The walls were covered in more of those strange symbols, and the air felt even colder here. But the strangest thing was the mirror on the far wall. It was cracked and dirty, but something about it drew our attention. It was as though the mirror itself was watching us. I took a step closer, raising my flashlight to get a better look. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving just behind my reflection. It wasn't Leo or Sam, it was something else, something darker. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and nearly collided with Sam, who had been right behind me. "What's wrong?" he asked. But before I could answer, the whispering started again. This time it was louder, clearer, like someone was speaking just inches from our ears. "You shouldn't be here," it said, a cold, breathy voice that seemed to seep into our bones. Leo, who had been silent, looked as terrified as I felt. "Let's get out of here," he whispered, and none of us argued. We turned to leave, but the hallway suddenly felt longer, like the walls were closing in around us. The door to the main room was barely visible in the distance, but we ran towards it, not daring to look back. Just as we reached the door, something grabbed my arm, a cold, bony grip that sent a shock of fear through me. I yanked my arm free, stumbling out of the cabin and into the clearing. Sam and Leo were right behind me, both of them just as shaken as I was. We didn't stop running until we were out of the woods, back on the familiar trail that led home. Only then did we dare to look back, but the cabin was hidden behind the trees, lost in the darkness. None of us spoke on the way back, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Even now, I can still feel that cold grip on my arm, the way it held me back, like it didn't want me to leave. We never went back to those woods, and we never told anyone what happened that night. Some things we figured were better left alone. It was a warm night, and my friends Jake, Oliver, and I were hanging out, bored out of our minds, looking for something to do. The idea of exploring the woods had always sounded fun, but it was late, and the forest nearby was thick and pitch black. Somehow, though, that made it sound even better. We grabbed some flashlights and decided to head out, just for the thrill of it. The forest trail wasn't far, and we'd walked it a few times during the day, but at night it felt like a completely different world. The trees loomed over us like giant shadows, and every small sound seemed louder than usual. The rustle of leaves, the crack of a twig, and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. After we'd walked for a bit, something cut through the stillness of the night. A loud bang, sharp and unmistakable. It was close, too close for comfort. We all froze, looking at each other in shock. "Was that a gunshot?" Oliver whispered, his face pale in the dim light of our flashlights. Jake looked around nervously. "I think so, but why would anyone be out here shooting at this time of night?" We considered turning back, but our curiosity got the better of us. We figured it could be hunters, even though that didn't make much sense so late at night. Slowly we crept forward, moving toward the direction the sound had come from. A few minutes later, we heard another shot. It was followed by voices, muffled but clear enough to tell that someone was definitely out there. We turned off our flashlights, afraid that we'd be seen, and moved as quietly as we could. The forest was thick, and it was tough to see more than a few feet in front of us, but we kept pushing forward. After what felt like ages, we saw a faint light up ahead, flickering through the trees. The voices were clearer now, rough, low voices that sounded angry. My stomach twisted as I realized we might be walking into something dangerous. Peering through the thick branches, we finally saw them. 3 men standing in a small clearing, their backs to us, and between them was another man, tied to a tree. He was slumped over, barely moving, and his face was bloodied and bruised. I felt my heart start to pound. This wasn't some game or prank. These guys were serious, and it was clear that they were hurting this man on purpose. Jake grabbed my arm, his face pale, and Oliver looked like he was about to be sick. One of the men stepped closer to the guy tied to the tree and said something we couldn't make out. Then he raised his arm and we saw the glint of a knife in his hand. The man on the tree flinched and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I wanted to do something, anything, but we were just kids, unarmed and outnumbered. Jake pulled me back and we ducked behind a fallen log, trying to stay hidden. We didn't speak, didn't dare make a sound. All we could do was watch, our eyes wide with fear. I wished more than anything that we'd never come out here, that we'd stayed home where it was safe. The men continued talking, their voices getting louder. It seemed like they were arguing about something. One of them gestured angrily toward the forest, pointing in the opposite direction from where we were hiding. Suddenly, there was a loud rustle as one of the men threw something, a bag maybe, onto the ground. The man with the knife turned and walked a few feet away, leaving the other 2 with the guy tied to the tree. We could see our chance to get away, but fear rooted us to the spot. That's when the man tied to the tree looked up, his eyes scanning the forest. For a brief second, they locked onto us. I don't know if he could really see us, hidden in the shadows, but there was a look of desperation in his eyes, like he was silently pleading for help. My throat went dry and I felt a wave of guilt. There was nothing we could do, nothing that wouldn't put us in danger too. I wanted to help him, but I knew we couldn't. Just then, another gunshot shattered the silence. The 3 men flinched, looking around, and I realized the shot had come from deeper in the forest. It was enough of a distraction for the men to turn away, their attention shifted. Without thinking, Jake grabbed my arm and we took our chance. We scrambled backward, moving as quickly and quietly as we could, trying not to make any noise. My heart pounded in my chest and every step felt like an eternity. I kept waiting for one of them to hear us, to turn and spot us, but somehow we made it out of their sight. Once we were far enough away, we broke into a full sprint, not daring to look back. The branches scratched at our faces and arms, but we didn't stop. We didn't stop until we were back at the edge of the forest, gasping for breath. That night, we didn't speak a word to each other. The weight of what we'd seen hung heavy in the air, and none of us wanted to acknowledge it. We'd gone out looking for adventure, but we'd found something else entirely. Even now, I still wonder what happened to that man in the forest, and if those men are still out there. But I don't go near those woods anymore, and I'll never forget the look in that man's eyes as he watched us disappear into the darkness. I'm 18 and I live in Northern California. Last year, I decided to go on a solo camping trip for a night on a secluded trail. I planned to start early, hike all day through the forested mountains, then head off trail and set up camp. The next day, I'd finish the hike and get picked up by my family where the trail ended at a dirt road. I'd been on this trail before with my dad and knew it well. It's not even on most maps, which is part of why I like it. Usually I'd be too cautious to camp alone, but this time I felt ready to do it on my own. Plus, I knew that it was unlikely I'd see anyone else out there. Even in the daytime, I'd never seen another hiker on that trail. One of the reasons I picked this trail is that I wanted to camp there, but the Park Service doesn't allow it. Since there wasn't much chance of running into other people, I figured it was safe. To keep a low profile, I didn't start a fire. Instead, I brought a propane cooker. I had everything I needed. My dad dropped me off at the trailhead, and I had 3 knives, a whistle in case of mountain lions, and a lot of experience in the area. I hiked all day, and it was beautiful, just what I'd hoped for. I finally reached my camp spot, which I'd picked out in advance, off the trail. I set up my tent, made dinner on the stove, and eventually went to bed. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, everything was quiet, and I thought maybe I'd just woken up for no reason. I lay there in the dark, listening. Then I heard a twig snap not far from my tent. I tried not to freak out and figured it might be a deer or raccoon. I thought about making a noise to scare it off, but before I could, I heard 2 distinct steps, crunching on pine needles and twigs. They sounded human. My heart started racing. I was way off the trail, in a place where I hadn't seen a single person before. I reached to my side for my buck knife and gripped it in my hand. The footsteps kept coming, not directly toward my tent, but moving closer, then stopping. I lay still, terrified, unable to make a sound even if I'd wanted to. Then I heard a deep, low humming. The sound was unmistakably human, and it confirmed my worst fear. I held onto my knife, knowing it was my only way to protect myself. I stayed quiet, hoping whoever it was would lose interest and leave. The humming continued for what felt like ages, then finally stopped. I listened as the person walked away, but I didn't relax. They scratched something onto a nearby tree, then I heard them dash off, making a huge commotion as they ran through the forest. Grass, pine needles, branches, everything cracked and rustled. I lay in my tent, gripped by fear, clutching the knife and wide awake until morning. As soon as the sun came up, I started packing my things as fast as I could, not wanting to stay there a second longer. I ran down the trail, constantly glancing over my shoulder. By noon, I'd reached the dirt road and called my family to pick me up. When they arrived, I told them everything. I haven't gone back to that trail since, and even though it was hard, I chose not to report what happened to the authorities. I had no proof of a crime, and I'd have to admit to camping illegally in the area, so I just kept it to myself.